Hello everybody, welcome back to American Textbook Reading. I'm Brian Stuart, and we're looking at Science book number 3, Lesson 9. Whew. Okay, how's the weather there? Are you having a good day? Well, that's what this lesson is about. Lesson 9 is about parts of weather. Did you know weather has different parts? Well, in this unit, we will discover about the different parts of the weather, and we will also learn what we use to measure the weather. Okay? So let's get started. As usual, we will start with the vocabulary. Now, there are many words that are related to weather because weather is very important for our lives. One interesting word about weather is hail. Have you seen hail before? Sometimes hail doesn't happen in certain parts of the world, but if you live in some colder parts of the world, you might see hail. What is hail? Hail is small, hard balls of ice that fall from the sky like rain. Now, I say small, but sometimes in some places, hail can be bigger. It can be big, and it can be dangerous. Right? In some places in America, I remember seeing news reports of big pieces of ice falling down. Now that can be dangerous and it can damage, usually it damages cars or homes. I don't remember, and I hope it never happens that somebody is hurt or injured or killed by hail, but it's possible, so you got to be careful. But hail is just ice falling from the sky, right? So it's kind of crazy when you see hail. Actually, we have a video showing hail, and this is not really strong hail. These are small pieces of ice, and you can't really see them in the air because, it's kind of a white sky, so it's hard to see the hail, but you can see it bouncing on the ground as it lands, and this is small hail. This is not a big deal. This is not dangerous. But if hail gets big, it can be dangerous. And usually people, the weather forecasters, will say, be careful. There's a warning for hail. And as soon as it starts hitting, people run inside, right? So yeah, be careful. But I don't mean to scare you. Hail is not that common, and it's not really dangerous, but it's really strange to see sometimes. When it does happen, it is interesting to see. Okay. Precipitation. Wow, what a big word. Precipitation. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 syllables. Precipitation. Precipitation. Precipitation is water that falls from the clouds to the ground. And guess what? The word we just learned, hail, it's ice, that's frozen water. So hail is a type of precipitation. Now, usually, when we talk about precipitation, we're talking about rain. But when it's winter time, the rain, of course, is liquid water. In the winter, the water freezes, and, it could come down as hail, but usually it comes down as snow. So there are many different types of precipitation. It's just water that falls from the clouds to the ground. Okay, so good. Yeah, precipitation, big word, but it covers many different types. Okay, good. A rain gauge. Now, a gauge is an instrument that measures something, usually how much or how many of something there is. In this case, a rain gauge is an instrument for measuring how much rain falls. So, weather forecasters, people who talk about the weather, they need numbers, right? They need to know exactly how much. So they might say, okay, tomorrow we expect 2 inches of rain. That's a lot of rain, right? So how did they measure that? Well, they have a rain gauge that tells them how much water will fall during a certain time and in a certain area. So they measure that. And they say, okay, we expect, 3 centimeters of rain tomorrow, for example. Okay, so a rain gauge. Remember, a gauge, there are many kinds of gauges, not just a rain gauge. There's a speed gauge in your car. It tells you how fast you're going. It's called a speedometer, not a speed gauge. It's called a speedometer, but it is a gauge. A gauge is any instrument that tells you the quantity, how much or how many of something there is. Okay, good. Next. Thermometer. Now, a thermometer is another type of gauge, right? It tells us how hot it is. What is the temperature? What degree? How many degrees is the air outside, right? Is it hot, a lot of degrees, or is it cold, very few degrees? How many, right? Or how much? Thermometer. A thermometer is a device, a gauge used to measure temperature. So of course, we have thermometers all over the world. There's two types of thermometers in use in the world. Of course, most of the world uses a thermometer in Celsius. Americans, for some reason, still use the old Fahrenheit. Did I spell that right? I think so. Height? I think it's height. Sorry. Nope, that's wrong. Height. Americans still use Fahrenheit. Why? They're old-fashioned. The rest of the world uses Celsius. When I came to Korea, I had to get used to Celsius because I was used to Fahrenheit. And so, I was used to, oh, it's 78 degrees out. That's great. But my Korean friend would say, 78 degrees, that's crazy, right? You can't live in 78 degrees. That's Celsius, right? 78 degrees Fahrenheit is a very nice day. Very, very great day. 80 degrees Fahrenheit, that's a nice day. But 80 degrees Celsius, yeah, you don't want to be there. Okay, so anyway, thermometer. Thermometer is a device used to measure temperature. Okay, good. Next. Okay, our next word is weather vane. A weather vane is another instrument that weather people use to talk about the weather. And a weather vane basically tells people which direction the wind is blowing. If you look at the picture here, it's kind of interesting, right? Because we see north, south, east, and west. So if we look at the weather vane, and these are usually on the tops of tall buildings, right? It's made of metal. It's a metal object that blows around. Blows around means it moves. It moves around, and it can move, 360 degrees to show which way the wind is coming from. So in this picture, we can see the wind makes the weather vane move in a certain way, and it points to the direction that the weather is coming from. So it looks like here, the weather is blowing in the direction of, looks like east, maybe a little bit north, okay? So it's coming from the south, or it's coming from the west, maybe a little bit south. That tells you which direction the wind is coming from. This is important to weather people who predict the weather, because, they study weather patterns, okay? And it's also important for farmers because they need to know, which way the wind is blowing. That might help them plan for the weather in the next few days. Okay, next. We have meteorologist, a meteorologist. Ologist, if you ever see this ending, that means someone who studies something. Someone who studies something. So, for example, I think I said before, my dad, in his career, he was a geologist. Geo means earth. So geologist is someone who studies the earth. So what is a meteorologist? A meteorologist is someone who studies meteors, right? No, I'm sorry, that's not true. Meteors, of course, are like Halley's Comet, or those objects that come around. Those are comets, but meteors are those things that fall to Earth. Now, meteorologists don't study those things. It's an interesting word. Why does meteorologist mean weather person, right? Someone who studies the weather. Well, that's that's what it means. That's it has an interesting history to it. But anyway, an ologist is someone who studies something. They don't study meteors. They study the weather. Okay, so yeah, be careful with that word. But usually, geologist studies Earth. Bio means life. So a biologist is someone who studies life, okay? So interesting. But this one is a bit weird. It's not weatherologist, it's meteorologist. Okay, so be careful with that word. So it's a scientist who studies weather conditions. And usually meteorologists are important because they can predict the weather. And when you watch the news, probably a meteorologist comes on and explains what the weather will be like tomorrow, the next day, next week. It's hard to predict 2 weeks in the future, but they try to. But usually it's an important, obviously an important job because we need to know whether it's going to rain, whether it's going to snow, if there's a flood coming, if there's a hurricane coming. So we need to know these things, and that's what meteorologists do. Okay, and those are our words for this lesson. Now, one of the ideas in this lesson is parts of weather. What are the different parts of weather? Interesting idea, right? Well, first of all, as we saw from the vocabulary, we have precipitation. And as I said before, it can fall as rain, hail, or snow. Precipitation, remember, is just water falling from the sky, okay, as a natural process of evaporation and condensation, right? The water evaporates, goes up into the cool air, condenses, gathers together, and then falls down as rain, hail, or snow. That's precipitation. Another part of temperature that meteorologists will talk about is temperature. And of course, when we talk about temperature, say, oh, what's the weather like? What is the weather like, or how is the weather? Right? Don't say how is the weather like. That is not correct. What is the weather like, or how is the weather? Okay, good. So it can be warm, it can be hot, right? 80 degrees Celsius is crazy hot. Okay, usually if it gets up 30 degrees, 35 degrees Celsius, oh, too hot, too hot. Okay, and 40 degrees Celsius, I've seen 40 degrees Celsius. I've never been in 40 degrees Celsius, but I've seen it on the news. Right, when you watch like CNN weather report, 40 degrees in Dubai. Oh, so hot, right? That's really hot. Okay, so I've never been in that, thank goodness. Okay, so any warm, hot, cool, or cold, right? Cold temperatures. Again, that's the other extreme. Okay, so that's temperature. Now, wind, of course, is another part of the weather. And wind can be slow, gentle. It can be refreshing, or it can be strong and furious, right? Like a hurricane. So wind is a very important part of the weather. It moves from warm areas. Wind moves from a warm area to a cool area, right? Warm area is a high pressure, right? Warm, of course, makes things expand, so it creates pressure. And a cool area, things are, if the temperature is cool, things tend to contract. So if you have hot area next to a cool area, the hot area wants to invade the cool area. So wind, of course, if it's hot air and cold air, the hot air wants to invade the cold area because it's under pressure. So that creates wind. As the air moves, that creates wind. So it moves from warm areas to cool areas. And warm air has a lot of moisture in it, right? As the temperature rises, more water evaporates and gets into the air, right? So when the warm air comes into the cool air, it carries the air and the water with it. And what happens to the water when it comes into a cool area? It gathers together again, it condenses, and then it falls down as rain. And that's why a lot of weather people, meteorologists, will talk about warm areas, cool areas, high pressure zone, low pressure zone, because they're talking about which direction the wind is moving in, which direction the weather is moving in, and possibly bringing rain, hail, or snow with it. Okay, that's maybe a little too complicated. But anyway, those are the parts of the weather. Okay, next. Weather instruments. Of course, we saw in the vocabulary, we saw there are many instruments for measuring the weather. Okay, first we have a rain gauge. And remember, there are many types of gauges. A rain gauge just measures the depth, how much, right? You can measure it. How deep is it? Is it 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters, 3 centimeters? How deep is the water that fell from the sky? That is a rain gauge, used to measure the depth of the precipitation. A thermometer, of course, is used to measure the temperature of the air. When you want to know how hot it is, whether it's in Fahrenheit or Celsius, you look at a temperature, you look at a thermometer, and that will tell you what the temperature is, okay? Whichever, and this thermometer, of course, has the two systems. It has Celsius on the left side, and it has Fahrenheit on the right side, okay? Yeah, interesting. Okay, it's used to measure the temperature of the air. Next, we talked about weather vane. Remember, a weather vane shows which way the wind is blowing. And the top part will move, not the bottom part, right? If the bottom part moved, we have no idea which way the wind is moving. So the bottom part is fixed, right? That doesn't move. The top part moves around. Okay, I should have made that clear before. But of course, the bottom part doesn't move. It's fixed. North is always north, right? But the top part will move, and then you can see which way the wind is blowing. Okay, good. The next picture shows a wind gauge. We have gauge again. Remember, gauge is a type of instrument that measures the quantity of something. And a wind gauge will measure the quantity of the wind, the quantity of the speed of the wind. So measure the wind's speed. How fast is it going? It's like, remember in your car, I told you about a speedometer. How fast is your car moving? But this instrument tells you how fast the wind is moving. Okay, so gauge, there are many types of gauges. Okay, good. Okay, the reading passage is about parts of the weather, and we're taking a look at meteorologists. Remember, meteorologists, they don't study meteors, they study the weather. Okay, so be careful with that word. Okay, a meteorologist, a little bit difficult to pronounce, right? Meteorologist. A meteorologist is a scientist who studies the weather. Meteorologists get information about the weather. They can predict what the weather will be like later on in the future. Like I said, maybe tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, next week, but 2 weeks from now, that's a little difficult. Okay, so, but later on means tomorrow, the next day, or next week. Okay, moving on. Precipitation, lots of big words. Precipitation is part of the weather. It can fall as rain, hail, or snow. A rain gauge is used to measure the amount of rain that falls in one spot. The temperature is an important part of the weather. A thermometer, another big word, a thermometer measures temperature. When it is warm, precipitation will fall as rain. When it is cold, precipitation might fall as hail or snow. Okay. Wind is another important part of the weather. Air moves from warm areas to cool areas. Wind is moving air. Wind can carry moisture into or away from an area. Wind can also change the temperature of the air in an area. A weather vane shows which direction the wind is blowing, right? So yeah, okay, just to summarize here, of course, not to summarize, but this last part, I just want to make a point. Wind can also change the temperature of the air in an area. That's very true, isn't it? If it's hot during the summertime, you're sweating, it's really humid. Wouldn't it be great if you had a nice wind blowing through? It cools everything down. That's why we use fans, right? Fans blow the air. It creates wind for us to carry that moisture away from our bodies and cool us down a little bit. So it doesn't always work, but hopefully it works. Okay, good. And then a weather vane shows which direction the wind is blowing. Okay, so that's our reading passage. Next, we're going to take a look at how this information is organized. Okay, we're looking at the organization of the reading passage, and as we can see, we have classify as our reading skill. Classify means to put things into different categories, and this is a very good reading passage for that type of organization because we can see there are different kinds of weather instruments, right? And in the reading passage, they talked about different kinds of instruments that meteorologists use to measure different parts of the weather. So, what are the different instruments? There are three main instruments, and we can classify them, right? So the first instrument is a rain gauge, and we talked about rain gauges, right? So what does a rain gauge do? Well, first we have a blank. A is a blank, so it starts a sentence with a blank. Beep can fall as rain, hail, or snow. So what can fall as rain, hail, or snow? What one word do we use to describe rain, hail, and snow? Do you remember that word? It's a long word. has 5 syllables. It's, of course, precipitation. 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 It can fall as rain, hail, or snow. Precipitation is just water that falls from the sky. So, a rain gauge is used to measure the amount of what? Well, of course, the amount of rain or water. Rain. Or you could even put precipitation, right? A rain gauge is used to measure the amount of precipitation or rain. It doesn't measure the amount of snow or hail, right? It measures the amount of rain. Okay, good. Thermometer. The thermometer, what does it do? The beep of the air is an important part of the weather. What do we talk about? The thermometer measures, well, temperature, right here. It's the next sentence, right? So that's actually what we have here. Temperature. Don't pronounce it like that. Temperature. Sometimes when you have a big word, you can overpronounce the syllables, like temperature. But don't say temperature, say temperature. Okay? Just for spelling, you can, think about it. Temperature. That's how you spell it. But when you say it, temperature. Okay, good. The temperature of the air is an important part of the weather. A thermometer measures temperature. Okay? So, yeah, a lot of these things go side by side. Okay. Weather vane is our third instrument, weather instrument. What does a weather vane do? Well, a weather vane shows the direction the what is blowing, right? When air moves, we call that wind. So, shows us which direction the wind is blowing. And the wind blows, okay? So you can say, which way is the wind blowing? You could say, which way is the wind moving? Yeah, that's possible, but it's much, much more common to say, which way is the wind blowing? Or the wind is blowing strong today. The wind is blowing fiercely today. Or the wind is blowing gently today. So the wind blows. Okay, so that is our lesson for today. Interesting. Weather, of course, is a very important part of our lives. It helps us plan our days. What are we going to do, right? If it's a sunny, warm day, let's go out and have fun. If it's a cold, snowy day, well, you could go outside and have fun too. You could go skiing. But if it's raining, probably want to stay inside, maybe play a game or do something else. Okay, so that's the different parts of the weather. I hope you learned a lot from this lesson, and of course some very interesting words and vocabulary that we picked up when talking about the weather. Thanks for studying with me. I hope to see you in the next one. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.